It is just after midnight, and the water off Catalina Island is black. Not the black of a movie screen before the picture starts. The black of nothing, of cold Pacific swells that have no interest in what floats on top of them. A 58-foot motor yacht called the Splendor is anchored in a cove called Isthmus Harbor, and somewhere aboard, a woman is no longer where she was. She is 43 years old. She is wearing a flannel nightgown, wool socks, and a red down jacket, as though she dressed for a walk she never intended to take. She has been drinking. She has been arguing. And she is terrified, has been terrified her entire life, of dark water. Her name, the one the studio gave her, is Natalie Wood. The name she was born with is Natasha Zakharenko. Both names belong to the same person, but they have never described the same woman. The distance between those two names, between the girl her mother invented and the person she tried to become, is the story. And the story does not begin in the water. It begins in the opposite of water. It begins in dust, in heat, in a small rented house in Santa Rosa, California, in 1943, where a 4-year-old girl with dark eyes is about to be offered to the movies by a mother who has been waiting for this moment since before the child was born. To understand how Natasha Zakharenko ended up in the Pacific Ocean on the night of November 28, 1981, we need to go back to a fortune teller in Harbin, China, and a prophecy that a mother chose to believe. Maria Zudilova was born in Barnaul in southern Siberia in 1908. Her father was a wealthy man by local standards. He owned soap and candle factories and an estate outside the city. But the Russian Civil War did not care about soap factories or estates. When the fighting reached their region, Maria's family fled, first overland, then across the border into China, where they joined the growing community of displaced Russians in Harbin, a Manchurian city that by the 1920s was swollen with refugees who had lost everything and remembered it constantly. Maria's paternal grandfather, who had fought with the anti-Bolshevik forces, was killed in a street fight between Red and White Russian soldiers. The family had no country to return to. It was in Harbin, according to family lore that Maria told and retold for the rest of her life, that she visited a fortune teller. A gypsy, she said. The fortune teller told her that her second child would be a great beauty, known throughout the world. But the fortune teller also issued a warning: beware of dark water. Maria carried that prophecy the way other women carry photographs. She carried it across the Pacific, through emigration to America, through a first marriage to an Armenian mechanic named Alexander Tatulov in 1925, through a daughter they named Olga, through a divorce in 1936, and into a second marriage in February of 1938, to a Russian carpenter named Nicholas Zakharenko, who was 4 years younger than she was. Maria would later shave 4 years off her own age and maintain the lie for the rest of her life. 5 months after the wedding, on July 20th in San Francisco, her second child was born, a girl. Maria named her Natasha. The first part of the prophecy said the child would be famous. Maria intended to make certain of that. The second part said the child should beware of dark water. Maria kept that part to herself for a while, and then she didn't. She told Natalie. She told her when she was still young enough for such a warning to lodge in the deepest part of her mind, where fears live before they have names. The family moved around. They changed their surname to Gurdon. They settled in Santa Rosa, a quiet town in Northern California, far from the ocean, far from Hollywood, far from anything that looked like destiny. Nicholas worked as a carpenter and a janitor. He drank. The household was tense, sometimes violent. Maria dreamed of being an actress or a ballerina herself, and when that dream proved impossible, she was a Russian immigrant with heavily accented English and no connections. She transferred it, whole and entire, onto her second daughter. In 1943, a film crew arrived in Santa Rosa to shoot a picture called Happy Land. Maria dressed her 4-year-old daughter in her best clothes and brought her to where the cameras were. She engineered an introduction to the director, Irving Pichel. According to some accounts, she instructed little Natasha to sit on his lap. The child appeared on screen for 15 seconds, credited only as little girl who drops ice cream cone. It was nothing. A moment. a flicker of a child in a movie almost no one remembers. But Pichel remembered her. He was charmed. He stayed in touch with the family for 2 years, watching, waiting for the right part. According to Natalie's sister Lana, Pichel was so taken with the child that he wanted to adopt her. When Pichel telephoned Maria about a screen test for the film Tomorrow is Forever, a drama starring Orson Welles and Claudette Colbert that needed a young girl to play a German war orphan, Maria did not pause to consider. She packed the entire family and moved to Los Angeles. Her husband opposed it. He did not want this life for his daughter. Maria's ambition was, as one account described it, overpowering. Nicholas's objections were irrelevant. It was not a conversation. It was a decision Maria had already made. Natasha, now 7, auditioned for the role of Margaret Ludwig. There was one problem. The character was required to cry in a key scene, and the child could not do it on command. Not yet. She had not yet learned to turn her emotions on and off like a switch. That would come later. What Maria did next has been confirmed by multiple sources close to the family and is one of the most frequently told stories in Hollywood biography. She took her daughter aside just before the screen test and tore a butterfly to pieces in front of her, pulled its wings off, one by one, while the child watched. Natasha sobbed. The cameras rolled. She got the part. There is a gentler version of the story in which Maria simply whispered to Natasha to think about the family dog dying. But the butterfly version is the one Natalie's sister Lana confirmed, the one biographer Suzanne Finstad documented through extensive interviews, and the one people who knew the family believed. It is the version that tells you everything you need to know about how Natalie Wood was made. The raw material was genuine feeling. The manufacturing process was calculated cruelty. Orson Welles, who was not an easy man to impress, and who had worked with every kind of actor the studio system could produce, later said the girl was a born professional. So good, he said, she was terrifying. He also said something else about her, something that would prove truer than he could have known. Natalie doesn't act from the script, she acts from the heart. The heart was the problem. It was always the problem, because the heart that made Natasha Zakharenko a great actress was the same heart her mother had learned, very early, could be broken on command and put to use. Studio executives at RKO, David Lewis and William Getz, renamed the child Natalie Wood after director Sam Wood to make her sound more American. She was 7 years old and already somebody else. Her younger sister Svetlana would later follow her into the business under the stage name Lana Wood. But Natalie was the one Maria had chosen. Natalie was the prophecy. By 1947, she was starring in Miracle on 34th Street, the Christmas film about a department store Santa Claus, playing a cynical little girl named Susan Walker who doesn't believe in magic. She was 8. The performance, watchful, funny, heartbreaking in the moment when belief finally cracks through her skepticism, made her a household name. Life magazine called her the most talented child cinema actress of her age. She was making $1,000 a week. She had a contract with 20th Century Fox. She was, at 8 years old, the family's primary breadwinner. The money she earned paid for the house, the food, the clothes. The family's survival depended on the career that Maria had engineered and that the child had no choice but to sustain. Maria controlled everything. She chose Natalie's roles, managed her schedule, dictated what she wore and who she talked to and where she went after school. On the rare days she went to school at all, since tutors on set handled most of her education. Maria kept Natalie in pigtails well into her early teens because younger-looking girls could still be cast as children, and child roles paid. When Natalie finally cut the pigtails off in an act of adolescent rebellion, Maria treated it as a betrayal, not of fashion, but of strategy. Every detail of the child's appearance was a business decision. Maria arranged dates for her teenage daughter with older men she believed could advance the girl's career. Men like Frank Sinatra, who was 38 when Natalie was 15. Men like Raymond Burr. A friend of the family, interviewed by Finstad years later, described Maria in terms that left no room for interpretation. Her mother was a pimp, But Maria's most consequential act of negligence, the one that would mark Natalie's body for the rest of her life, happened on a film set in 1949 during the making of a picture called The Green Promise. Natalie was 10 years old, cast opposite Walter Brennan in a farming drama. The script called for her character to cross a wooden bridge during a thunderstorm. The bridge was rigged to collapse, but only after she had reached the other side. That was the plan. The bridge was to give way behind her, sending water and debris crashing while the child was safe on solid ground. But a technician tripped the mechanism too early. The bridge collapsed while Natalie was still on it. She was thrown into rushing water, churning from rain machines and wind effects, and she clung to what remained of the bridge while the water tore at her small body, and the director, William D. Russell, shouted at his crew to keep the cameras rolling. He was getting good footage. The terrified child thrashing in the wreckage of the bridge was exactly the kind of authenticity you could not fake, and Russell knew it. She broke her left wrist. She eventually pulled herself out, shaking, crying, soaked, injured, and her mother refused to let her see a doctor. Maria was afraid that medical treatment would interfere with the shooting schedule, that a cast on her daughter's arm would slow production, that word would spread through the studios that the girl was fragile. Natalie didn't cry when her wrist was broken, her sister Lana later wrote, or even mention the injury to anyone at the studio because complaining might have shortened her career. The child had been trained, pain was private, and the career came first. The wrist healed without being properly set. The bone protruded, a visible lump, a deformity that Natalie could feel every time she touched it, every time someone held her hand, every time a camera angled toward it. For the rest of her life, she wore a bracelet on her left wrist to hide it. In photographs, in films, on red carpets and yacht decks, and in magazine layouts, the bracelet is always there. She wore it in Rebel Without a Cause. She wore it in West Side Story. She wore it in Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. She almost never allowed herself to be photographed without it. Biographer Finstad called it the badge. That bracelet is worth keeping in mind. It will come back. The near drowning on the Green Promise fused with the fortune teller's prophecy, which Maria had by now shared with her daughter, to create something that lived inside Natalie for the rest of her life. Not a dislike, not unease, a phobia, a deep, clinical, persistent terror of dark water. Friends recalled she was afraid to have her hair washed. She had recurring nightmares about drowning. She could not put her head under water in a bathtub. Her half-sister Olga once explained it simply, "My mother was afraid of swimming as she was told that she'd drown, so this communicated itself to Natalie." At 14, while filming a scene for the Bette Davis picture The Star, Natalie was given the choice of jumping off the back of a boat into the ocean or losing the role. She jumped. She became hysterical immediately afterward. The scene was usable. The terror was not acted. Years later, she told an interviewer, with a directness that made people uncomfortable, "I'm frightened to death of the water. I can swim a little bit, but I'm afraid of water that is dark." She said this knowing that her mother had told her, when she was still a child, still too young to protect herself from the knowledge, that a fortune teller had seen her death in dark water. By the time Natalie reached her teens, she had appeared in more than 20 films. She was efficient and professional, so reliable on set that crew members called her One-Take Natalie. She memorized not just her own lines, but everyone else's, a habit she developed as a child and never lost. But outside the studio walls, she was trapped in a life she had never chosen. Maria dictated her social life, forced her to break up with a boyfriend named Jimmy Williams, whom she had met at Van Nuys High School because Maria was afraid her daughter would get pregnant, and began steering her toward relationships with powerful men who could serve the career. At 15, Finstad documented, Natalie was pushed into the orbit of Frank Sinatra. At 16, she began a relationship with Nicholas Ray, the 43-year-old director, who was about to cast her in the film that would change everything. That film was Rebel Without a Cause. The year was 1955. James Dean was the star, electric and doomed, burning with a charisma so raw that even the other actors on set were drawn into his gravity. Sal Mineo played Plato, the lonely boy. And Natalie Wood, 16 years old, played Judy, the girl caught between her father's hostility and her own desperate, inarticulate need to be loved by someone who saw her. The role required a kind of emotional nakedness that most seasoned actresses struggled with. Natalie walked into it and disappeared. She was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. In 1955, Life magazine named her the most beautiful teenager in the world. The following year, she appeared in John Ford's The Searchers, playing Debbie Edwards, a white girl kidnapped as a child by Comanches, the object of John Wayne's obsessive, years-long quest. It is one of the greatest American films ever made, and Natalie's presence in it, both as a child in the early scenes and as a young woman in the later ones, anchors its emotional argument about identity and belonging. She was no longer a child actress. She was something rarer and more complicated. A young woman whose performances felt like confessions, who projected vulnerability so convincingly that audiences forgot they were watching someone act. They thought they were watching someone break. What they did not know was that the vulnerability was not entirely a performance. In the summer of 1955, according to testimony gathered by Finstad from 5 of Natalie's close friends and later confirmed publicly by her sister Lana, Natalie was sexually assaulted. She was 16. The assailant was a powerful married actor, a man she had admired, a man whose films she had watched with her mother in darkened theaters. Lana Wood would later say the attack took place at the Chateau Marmont in Los Angeles during what Natalie believed was an audition, and that it went on for hours. Professor Cynthia Lucia, who studied the allegation, described the assault as brutal and violent. Natalie was physically injured. She told a small circle of trusted friends, actors Scott Marlowe and Dennis Hopper among them. She did not go to the police. Her mother, according to those same friends, knew what happened and told Natalie to keep silent. The man was too powerful. The career was too important. Natalie, schooled by Maria in the politics of Hollywood, understood she would keep the secret and behave as if nothing had happened whenever their paths crossed, which, in Hollywood, they inevitably did. In 2021, a year after the death of Kirk Douglas, Lana Wood published a memoir identifying Douglas as the alleged assailant. The allegation has not been independently adjudicated, and Douglas, who died at 103, was never publicly confronted with it during his lifetime. But the accounts of Natalie's friends, gathered by Finstad decades before Lana's identification, are consistent. A violent assault by a powerful older actor that Natalie carried in silence for the rest of her life. She never spoke of it publicly, but people who knew her well said it marked her. She carried it the way she carried the bracelet on her wrist, always present, always concealed, visible only to those who knew where to look. Friends from that period described 2 Natalies, the one who smiled for the cameras, who arrived on time, who hit her mark and said her lines perfectly, and the one who sat in a therapist's office trying to understand why she felt, as she once wrote privately, that she had no real identity and had always done as she was told. By 1957, Natalie Wood was 19 and one of the most recognizable young women in America. She stood just under 5'2", wore high stiletto heels to appear taller, and had a face that camera operators said the lens loved without qualification. She married Robert Wagner, square-jawed, charming, 6 years her senior, a contract player at 20th Century Fox in Scottsdale, Arizona, on December 28. She had first spotted him at a studio event when she was about 11 years old and reportedly told her mother she would marry him someday. The press treated the wedding like a national event. Fan magazines called it the glittering union of the century. For a while, they looked like a fairy tale. But fairy tales are stories told by mothers, and Natalie's mother had already told her the only fairy tale that mattered, the one about the great beauty and the dark water. Even the honeymoon was touched by it. The couple had planned a cruise, but a violent storm forced its cancellation. The water, it seemed, did not want to be forgotten. The marriage lasted 4 years. What ended it has been disputed for decades, and the dispute has never been settled. The public version was that Natalie had an affair with Warren Beatty, her co-star in Splendor in the Grass. She never explicitly denied it, and the gossip calcified into accepted Hollywood fact. But according to Finstad, who interviewed Natalie's mother Maria, her sister Lana, and her close friend Marianne Brooks, the truth was different. Natalie came home one evening in the first half of 1961 and discovered Wagner in their Beverly Hills home with another man. She fled to her parents' house, locked herself in her childhood bedroom, and took an overdose of sleeping pills. She woke up in a hospital, dazed and in shock. She never spoke about what she had seen. Not publicly, not to the press. She took the blame for the divorce to protect Wagner's career and his image. She kept his secret for the rest of her life, even as the rumors about her and Beatty were reported as fact, and she was cast as the unfaithful wife. Years later, a private memoir in Natalie's handwriting was discovered. In it, she addressed the Beatty rumors directly. There was gossip and speculation that Warren was in some way responsible for the end of the marriage. It is totally untrue. She also confirmed a rift between herself and Beatty during the filming of Splendor in the Grass, noting that, between takes, Warren and I went our separate way. The affair came later, after the marriage was already dead. The divorce was finalized in April of 1962. Natalie entered psychoanalysis. She would continue therapy for years, and she would eventually encourage Wagner to do the same when they reconnected. Wagner later said that therapy saved his life. For Natalie, it was something else, an excavation, a slow uncovering of a self that had been buried beneath a mother's ambitions and an industry's demands since she was 4 years old. And it was during this period of dissolution and searching that she did the best work of her life. 1961 was her year, the year when everything aligned. Elia Kazan, the director she had idolized since childhood, ever since the afternoon her mother took her to see A Streetcar Named Desire, and she sat in the darkened theater, transfixed by Vivian Leigh, cast her as Wilma Dean Loomis in Splendor in the Grass. The Hollywood establishment had written Natalie off. Kazan recalled that the sages of the film community considered her washed up. Her most recent film, All the Fine Young Cannibals, had lost MGM over $1 million. She was 22 and already, by industry standards, finished. But when Kazan met with her, he saw something behind the polished young wife's surface. He described it as a desperate twinkle in her eyes. He talked to her quietly, personally. He wanted to know what was underneath. And he found what he called a true blue quality with a wanton side that is held down by social pressure. He cast her immediately. The film required Natalie to play a young woman in 1920s Kansas driven toward madness by the gulf between her desires and what her world permits her to feel. In the bathtub scene, one of the most famous scenes in American film, she had to submerge herself in water, thrashing, screaming, as her character's composure disintegrates. Think about what that meant for her, the woman who was afraid to wash her hair, the woman who had nightmares about drowning. She took off the bracelet that hid the broken wrist that she wore every single day. And she went into the water, and she screamed. Finstad wrote that the combination of Kazan's direction, Natalie's emotional connection to the mother-daughter conflict in the scene, and the raw panic of being underwater without her bracelet produced what may have been her most powerful moment as an actress. Gary Lockwood, a co-star, said simply, "Kazan and Natalie were a terrific marriage because you had this beautiful girl, and you had somebody that could get things out of her." Kazan himself loved the film's final scene most, when Natalie's character returns to see Bud, her lost first love, played by Beatty. "It's terribly touching to me," Kazan wrote in his memoir. "I still like it when I see it. I didn't have to give her any direction for that final scene. She knew exactly how to play it." She was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. That same year, 1961, she played Maria in West Side Story, Jerome Robbins, and Robert Wise's film adaptation of the Bernstein and Sondheim stage musical. Her singing was dubbed by Marnie Nixon, a fact the studio worked hard to conceal from the public, and that Natalie found humiliating. She could carry a tune. She was not tone deaf. But the producers wanted operatic perfection, and Nixon provided it. The dubbing was an open secret in the industry and a sore point for years. But Natalie's physical performance, her face, her body, her ability to convey longing and joy and grief without a single word of dialogue, anchored the film. She was luminous. The film grossed $44 million, making it the highest-grossing picture of 1961. It won 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It remains, more than 6 decades later, one of the most successful movie musicals ever made. The following year, she took the title role in Gypsy, playing burlesque entertainer Gypsy Rose Lee opposite Rosalind Russell as her ferocious stage mother, Mama Rose. Film historians have argued that it was an even stronger performance than her Maria, sharper, funnier, more emotionally layered. There is something almost uncomfortable about watching Natalie play a young woman whose mother has engineered her entire career, who was pushed onto stages she never chose, who discovers her own identity only by stripping away, layer by layer, the persona her mother constructed. The parallels to her own life are so precise they feel deliberate, though there is no evidence that anyone on the production was thinking about it that way. The film was the 8th highest-grossing release of 1962. Then came Love with the Proper Stranger in 1963, opposite Steve McQueen. She played Angie Rossini, a Macy's sales clerk who has a one-night stand with a musician and finds herself pregnant, facing the prospect of an illegal abortion. It was a brave role for the era, frank about sex and its consequences in ways that mainstream Hollywood usually avoided. Another Oscar nomination, her 3rd in 8 years. She was 25 years old. She was also, by that point, the youngest person ever to have received 3 Academy Award nominations before the age of 25, a record at the time. At that point, she was one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood, and she was falling apart. The relationship with Warren Beatty was volcanic. It didn't begin on the set of Splendor in the Grass. Her friend Mark Crowley, who knew both of them well, insisted that nothing happened between them until long after filming wrapped and that her split with Wagner had nothing to do with Beatty. But once it started, it was consuming. Natalie described it in an unpublished article for Ladies' Home Journal as a collision from start to finish. While RJ never did express hostility, Warren couldn't stop, and I contributed my share of fireworks too. They traveled to the Cannes Film Festival together in May of 1962, just a month after Natalie's divorce from Wagner was finalized. She attended as the festival's honorary Étoile de Cannes and walked the red carpet with Beatty for the screening of his John Frankenheimer drama All Fall Down, which was in competition for the Palme d'Or. Lana later wrote that, together in public, they were something to behold. Beautiful, exciting, sophisticated. But privately, the relationship was pulling Natalie apart. Beatty was charming and brilliant and, by universal agreement, one of the most prolific womanizers in Hollywood history. The intensity he brought to pursuing women was matched only by his restlessness once he had them. During this period, Natalie also dated, briefly or otherwise, a string of men that read like a mid-century Hollywood social register: Arthur Lowe Jr., the theater scion, Ladislav Blatnik, whom gossip columns referred to as the Shoe King of Venezuela, actor Michael Caine, David Niven Jr., director Henry Jaglom. She had a brief connection with Elvis Presley as far back as 1956, though according to Bobby Ann Mason's biography of Presley, the two didn't have much in common. But Beatty was the one who got under her skin. When Beatty came to see her in 1966, wanting her for Bonnie and Clyde, a role she ultimately turned down, and that went to Faye Dunaway, transforming Dunaway into a star, and the film into a landmark of New Hollywood. The encounter destabilized her completely. She took a handful of barbiturates. After having her stomach pumped at a Hollywood hospital, she told her sister Lana that at that moment, she had not wanted to live. Wagner, meanwhile, consumed by years of jealousy over the Beatty affair, admitted in his 2008 memoir, Pieces of My Heart, to sitting outside Beatty's house at night with a gun. "I was pretty young," he later told Reuters. and I don't think I could have ever gone through with that act, but I was pretty frustrated and upset. He described Beatty as pretty smooth, very attractive. He was the man. While Life magazine was calling Beatty the most exciting American male in movies, Wagner's own last 4 or 5 pictures had been flops. The imbalance ate at him. After Beatty, Natalie met British producer Richard Gregson through their mutual friend Robert Redford, who was Gregson's client at the time. But that relationship was still a few years off. In the mid-60s, Natalie was working steadily and building a body of performances that would look better and better as the decades passed. She made Sex and the Single Girl with Tony Curtis in 1964, light, funny, and commercially successful. The Great Race with Jack Lemmon and Curtis in 1965 was a massive comedy that put her opposite 2 of the best comic actors of the era, but the films she made with Robert Redford were the ones that showed her range most fully. Inside Daisy Clover, in 1965, cast her as a teenage tomboy who becomes a Hollywood star in the 1930s. A Hall of Mirrors role for a woman who had lived that exact trajectory. The film was not a commercial success, but Natalie's performance anticipated a rawness that Hollywood wasn't quite ready for. Then came This Property is Condemned in 1966, directed by Sidney Pollack, adapted from Tennessee Williams, with Natalie playing Alva Starr, a small-town Southern beauty trapped by circumstance and desire. Pollack would later say, "She was a sensational actress, often underrated because she was a movie star and as pretty as she was. She had a combination of vulnerability and a kind of aura." Bogdanovich, who initially resisted making a biographical film about her years later, said that revisiting her 60s work changed his mind entirely. In Love with the Proper Stranger, Inside Daisy Clover, This Property is Condemned. Her performances are brilliant, really brilliant. I realized she was really underrated as an actress, and that, up until then, I had been one of the people who underrated her. Redford, who knew her from Van Nuys High School and had worked with her on multiple films, later narrated a Turner Classic Movies tribute to her. He remembered her fondly, noting that he could talk to her about the nonsense and distortion of what it is to be a movie star, because she understood it from the inside. But the industry was changing around her. The studio system was collapsing. New Hollywood wanted anti-heroes and moral ambiguity. Easy Rider and Midnight Cowboy and Bonnie and Clyde, the very film she had turned down. Natalie Wood, with her emotional transparency and her classical beauty and her bracelet hiding a childhood injury, belonged to a tradition that was being dismantled around her. She was not Faye Dunaway. She was not Jane Fonda. She was 30 years old, and she had been in movies since she was 4, and the world that had made her was disappearing. Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice in 1969 proved she could survive the transition. It was a smart, hip sex comedy about 2 couples experimenting with the counterculture, and it grossed over $30 million. Earlier in the decade, the Harvard Lampoon had given her their Worst Actress of the Year award. Natalie became the first performer to accept the award in person, showing up with a warmth and self-deprecating humor that disarmed everyone present. She could still surprise people, but instead of pressing forward, she stepped away. She married British producer Richard Gregson in 1969. Robert Redford, her classmate from Van Nuys High School, a teenager so indifferent to celebrity that he had once refused to let her into a school assembly because she was late, not realizing she was a movie star, served as best man. Redford was also Gregson's client, which is how Natalie had met him. Their daughter Natasha was born on September 29, 1970. Motherhood transformed Natalie in ways that everyone around her could see. She had never been allowed to be a child herself, had been working since she was 4, supporting the family since she was 8, navigating her mother's manipulation since before she could form memories of any other kind of life. Now, holding her own daughter, she was determined to do everything differently. She stepped away from the camera almost entirely. Friends who visited described a Natalie they had never seen: calm, present, absorbed in the rituals of feeding and bathing and rocking a baby to sleep. The documentary Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind, includes home movie footage from this period, and what strikes you is how ordinary she looks. Not a movie star, but a mother. One friend recalled that Natalie, who had spent her life being looked at, seemed happiest when nobody was looking at her at all. The Gregson marriage was, by most accounts, happy at first, but Natasha's birth changed the balance. Natalie became so consumed with motherhood that Gregson felt there was no room for him. And then came the phone call. Natalie overheard a conversation between Gregson and her own secretary that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. She threw him out. There was no second chance, no reconciliation, no period of trying to work things out. She was done. The divorce was finalized in 1972. Gregson returned to England. Natalie would later say the split was amicable, though the circumstances suggest otherwise. And then, in a move that bewildered even people who thought they understood the rhythms of Hollywood marriages, she remarried Robert Wagner. The reconnection happened at a dinner party in 1970, one that each attended alone. Both were freshly divorced, Wagner from actress Marion Marshall, with whom he had a daughter named Katie, in 1971. They talked. They found that the years apart had changed them, or at least they believed they had. Wagner had spent the 60s in Europe, rebuilding his career in television, becoming the suave star of It Takes a Thief. He had, he said, grown up. Natalie accepted an invitation to his house in Palm Springs. "We were both in shock," she told People magazine. "We talked about what had happened to our marriages. He had become a man instead of a boy." Friends told her to slow down. She said something that seems, in retrospect, either very brave or very self-aware. "We knew each other better than we knew ourselves. I always knew he was okay. It was myself I didn't know about." They married in July of 1972, 3 months after her second divorce was final. It was a smaller wedding than the first. No magazine covers, no breathless headlines about glittering unions. They were older now. Their daughter, Courtney, was born in 1974. Wagner adopted Natasha, who began calling him Daddy Wagner while referring to her biological father as Daddy Gregson. Together with Wagner's daughter Katie, they formed a blended family of 5. Natalie nearly vanished from the screen. "Work doesn't play the same role in my life it used to," she said. She was deliberate about it. She had watched her own mother sacrifice everything, her other daughters, her marriage, her daughter's childhood, on the altar of a career, and she was determined not to repeat the pattern. Between the early 70s and her death, she appeared in only a handful of projects. She cooked. She decorated for Christmas with an enthusiasm that friends found both charming and surprising. She drove her daughters to school. She threw dinner parties where the guest lists mixed old Hollywood, Sinatra, the Nivens, with younger friends like Mart Crowley and Robert Redford. People who visited the house described a woman who seemed, finally, at peace. Wagner, now a television star on Heart to Heart, was the steady, reliable husband she had always wanted him to be. But there were signs, visible only later, that the peace was more fragile than it appeared. Natalie still saw her therapist. She still drank, not heavily most of the time, but friends noticed that when things got tense, the drinking increased. She was taking prescription medication. And she never fully resolved the central contradiction of her life. She had been made for the screen, built for it by a mother who would not take no for an answer. And now she was trying to live as if the screen didn't matter. The woman who had been one-take Natalie since childhood, who had given Elia Kazan a performance so raw it made him weep, was arranging flowers and watching her husband film a television show. But the water was always there. The Wagners owned a yacht. They named it Splendor, after Splendor in the Grass. The film where Natalie took off the bracelet and put her head underwater and screamed. They used the boat often for weekend trips to Catalina Island and cruises along the coast. Natalie went aboard. She even seemed to enjoy the trips. But friends noticed she stayed in the salon, on the deck, always above the waterline. She did not swim. She did not wade. She did not go near the water after dark. The woman who had nightmares about drowning spent her weekends floating on top of the thing she feared most, on a boat named after the film where she confronted that fear for art. Their friend Mart Crowley, the playwright who wrote The Boys in the Band, was a regular companion on these trips. In photographs aboard the Splendor, everyone is always smiling. In the late 70s, Natalie began testing the professional waters again. She appeared in a 1976 television production of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, playing Maggie the Cat opposite Wagner, to strong reviews. Then came the 1979 miniseries From Here to Eternity, in which she played Karen Holmes with a controlled intensity that reminded Hollywood of what she could do when she had material that matched her. She won the Golden Globe Award for Best Actress in a television drama. That same year, she appeared in the disaster film Meteor, opposite Sean Connery, which was poorly received. But the Golden Globe win was what mattered. People were paying attention again. By 1981, she was ready for a genuine comeback. She signed on for Brainstorm, a science fiction film directed by Douglas Trumbull, the special effects master behind 2001, A Space Odyssey, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and Blade Runner. The cast included 3 Academy Award winners, Christopher Walken, Louise Fletcher, and Cliff Robertson. Natalie would play Karen Brace, a product designer whose marriage to Walken's character is falling apart. It was an intelligent adult role in an ambitious picture. To prepare the cast and crew, Trumbull took them to the Esalen Institute, an experimental retreat in Northern California known for its workshops on human potential and consciousness, an appropriate beginning for a film about recording and replaying human experience. Natalie spoke about the project with genuine enthusiasm, the kind of creative excitement that friends said they hadn't heard from her in years. There is an aspect to the film that deals with the ability to experience things through another person's eyes, she told an interviewer. To walk in another person's shoes. I think there is a kind of universal curiosity in that, and I don't think that has been dealt with in films. There was an irony in those words that no one could have anticipated. A film about experiencing life through another person's consciousness, made by a woman who had spent her entire career channeling the emotions of others while keeping her own locked away. She had also accepted a role in a stage production of Anastasia, scheduled to open at the Amundsen Theater in Los Angeles on February 12, 1982, alongside British actress Wendy Hiller. It would have been Natalie's theatrical debut, a 43-year-old woman who had been in movies since she was 4, stepping onto a live stage for the first time. And the role carried a resonance so perfect it bordered on the uncanny. Anastasia, the story of a Russian woman who may or may not be the lost daughter of the murdered Tsar, a woman whose identity is either genuine or manufactured, who may be who she claims to be or may be a creation of other people's needs and projections. Natalie, born Natasha Zakharenko, child of Russian immigrants who had fled Siberia, a woman whose entire public identity had been constructed by her mother and the studio system, playing the most famous identity mystery in Russian history. She also purchased the film rights to a novel by Barbara Wurzba called Country of the Heart, and was planning to star opposite Timothy Hutton in the adaptation. She never got to do any of it. Filming on Brainstorm had proceeded through September and October of 1981. Location work in North Carolina at Duke University and Research Triangle Park, where the production used the Duke Center for Hyperbaric Medicine as a set for the scientist's laboratory, then interior scenes back at MGM in Culver City. The film was Trumbull's passion project. He had conceived it as a showcase for his experimental show scan process, which shot at 60 frames per second in 70mm film, producing an image of startling clarity. MGM, perpetually strapped for cash, had refused to fund the show scan format, and Trumbull compromised by alternating between standard 35mm for reality scenes and Super Panavision 70 for the virtual reality sequences. It was an innovative approach. It was also expensive, and MGM was already getting nervous. By late November, the production was nearly complete. Only a few scenes remained. Thanksgiving was approaching. Christopher Walken, who had grown close to Natalie during the weeks on location, decided to stay in Los Angeles rather than fly back to New York. His wife, Georgianne, did not join him for reasons that have never been publicly explained. Natalie and Wagner invited Walken to Thanksgiving dinner at their home, and then for a weekend cruise to Catalina aboard the Splendor. Other friends had been invited on the boat trip, at least 2 other couples, according to some accounts, but all declined due to other commitments. That left 4 people aboard: Natalie Wood, Robert Wagner, Christopher Walken, and the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern. On Friday, November 27th, the Splendor left Marina del Rey. They sailed to Avalon, the main town on Catalina Island. They went ashore. They drank. By all accounts, the drinking was heavy. Davern would later describe a jealousy that had been building under the surface all weekend. Wagner was bothered by the attention Natalie was paying to Walken, the closeness that had developed between them during weeks of filming far from home. A witness on a nearby boat later told investigators that on Friday night, she observed a man and a woman arguing on the back of the Splendor. The woman appeared intoxicated and appeared to be the aggressor. The man appeared to be trying to walk away. On Saturday, November 28th, the group went ashore again for dinner at Doug's Harbor Reef restaurant in the small town of 2 Harbors. More drinking. Then back to the Splendor. Around 10 in the evening, something that had been building for 2 days finally broke open. What happened next depends entirely on who is telling the story, and when they told it, and to whom. Wagner's account, given to sheriff's investigators the following day, was calm and orderly. Natalie went to bed in their cabin around 10:45. He stayed up talking with Walken. When he eventually went to join her, she was not there. The dinghy, a small inflatable called the Valiant, was also missing. He assumed she had taken it ashore. Walken's account was similar. There had been a discussion about Natalie's career, whether she was spending too much time away from home working. He acknowledged getting involved, siding with Natalie, before realizing he was violating his own rule about not getting involved in arguments between husband and wife. He stepped outside for air. He said Natalie went to bed shortly after. Dennis Davern, the captain, initially told investigators the same thing. A clean story. An orderly story. 3 men, the same story. But Davern's account changed. It changed slowly, over years, and it changed in ways that investigators found both troubling and ultimately credible. In a 2000 article for Vanity Fair, Davern described a night of escalating fury. He said Wagner had smashed a wine bottle on the table and screamed at Walken. He said Wagner and Natalie had fought behind the closed door of their cabin, a violent, terrifying fight, audible through the walls. He said the last words he heard Wagner say to Natalie were words that investigators would later ask him to repeat multiple times. Davern acknowledged that he had initially lied, and he gave his reasons: fear of legal trouble, fear of losing future employment, and a sense of being pressured to align his account with Wagner's version. Investigators who re-interviewed him years later called his revised account very credible and said it was corroborated by other witnesses. Here is what everyone agrees on. Natalie, at some point, was in her flannel nightgown and wool socks. She was not dressed to go anywhere. She was not dressed to descend a swim ladder and climb into a rubber dinghy in cold, rough water in the middle of the night. And she was afraid. Everyone who knew her agreed on this absolutely. She was terrified of exactly the kind of water that surrounded the boat. Marilyn Wayne, who was on a boat moored approximately 80 feet from the Splendor, told investigators she heard a woman's voice crying out across the water at around 11 o'clock. "Somebody please help me! I'm drowning!" The cries continued, Wayne said, until approximately 11:30. Wayne and her boyfriend tried to call the harbor master. No one answered. There was a party happening on another nearby boat. They thought it might be a joke or someone fooling around. They went back to bed. Wagner did not call for help until 1:30 in the morning, more than 2 hours after Wayne heard the screaming, and perhaps 3 or more hours after Natalie went into the water. When he finally called, it was to the shore, not the Coast Guard. Davern later said Wagner had told him not to turn on the boat's searchlights when they first realized Natalie was missing. Wagner said he did not want to draw attention to the situation. The official search did not begin until approximately 6 a.m. on Sunday morning. At around 8 o'clock, Catalina Harbormaster Doug Bombard found Natalie Wood's body floating in the water near Blue Cavern Point, about a mile from the Splendor. She was upright, held afloat by the red down jacket she had pulled on over her nightgown. Her eyes were open. The dinghy was found nearby, beached, with scratch marks on its sides. Los Angeles County Chief Medical Examiner Thomas Noguchi performed the autopsy. He found an elevated blood alcohol level, bruises on her arms, her legs, her right knee, an abrasion on her left cheek, a scratch on her neck, a superficial scrape on her forehead. He ruled the cause of death accidental drowning and hypothermia, theorizing she had slipped while trying to board or retie the dinghy to stop it from banging against the yacht's hull. He described the bruises as superficial and probably sustained at the time of drowning. He wrote, "No other trauma noted, and foul play is not suspected at this time." The case was closed on December 11th, 12 days after the investigation began. On December 2nd, Natalie Wood was buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. The pallbearers were Frank Sinatra, Rock Hudson, Laurence Olivier, Elia Kazan, Gregory Peck, David Niven, and Fred Astaire. Robert Wagner, weeping, kissed the coffin. Elizabeth Taylor was in the crowd. It was the kind of funeral Hollywood stages for the very famous and the very loved, the industry gathering to mourn one of its own. Cameras outside, flowers everywhere, famous faces made small by grief. For 30 years, that is where the story might have ended. But there is something that needs to be said about the bracelet. When Natalie's body was pulled from the water, she was wearing 4 rings, the tag necklace she always wore, and a bracelet. But not that bracelet, not the thick one, the public one, the one Finstad called the badge. She was wearing a different bracelet, a smaller one. She had not put on the armor. She had not been planning to be seen. After Natalie's death, her mother Maria took a painted portrait of her daughter. A formal portrait, the kind that hangs on a wall and watches the room. And with a knife or a pair of scissors, she cut a slash across the left wrist of the image. Then, she took a real bracelet, a physical object, and glued it over the wound in the painting. As if even the picture needed protecting. As if even oil paint could bleed. What Maria was thinking when she did this, no one can say. But the gesture speaks to the central truth of Natalie's life. The compulsion to conceal damage, to cover wounds, to present a polished surface so complete that no one would think to look beneath it. Maria had created Natalie Wood from the raw material of Natasha Zakharenko, and even in death, even in a painting, the creation needed to be maintained. The case did not stay closed. In 2009, Dennis Davern published his book, Goodbye Natalie, Goodbye Splendor, admitting he had lied to police in 1981 and asserting that Wagner knew far more than he had ever revealed. In 2011, over 700 people signed a petition demanding the investigation be reopened. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department agreed. In June of 2012, the coroner amended Natalie Wood's death certificate. The cause of death was changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. The new wording cited a re-examination of the bruises on her body. A medical doctor, who had been an intern at the coroner's office during the original autopsy, came forward to say that the bruises were substantial and consistent with someone being thrown out of a boat. In February of 2018, the Sheriff's Department reclassified Wood's death as suspicious and named Robert Wagner a person of interest. They said they had new witness statements describing a man and a woman arguing on the back of the yacht. Lieutenant John Carina told reporters, "I haven't seen him tell the details that match all the other witnesses in this case. He's changed his story a little bit." Wagner, through his representatives, denied all wrongdoing. He was never arrested, never charged. In his 2008 memoir, he acknowledged angry words with Walken that night, mostly about whether Natalie should devote more time to her career. but he maintained he did not know how she ended up in the water. In a later interview with the Daily Mail, he said he blamed himself for her death. Not because he had done anything, but because he had not been there to save her. Christopher Walken, throughout all of this, the reopened investigation, the books, the documentaries, the 12-part podcast, the tabloid covers that appeared every November on the anniversary of Natalie's death, said almost nothing. He hired a lawyer to handle inquiries and declined to comment further. In nearly 45 years, he has given no substantive public account of what happened aboard the Splendor that night. His silence has been interpreted in every possible way, as guilt, as grief, as legal prudence, as simple discomfort, and has explained nothing. The case moved to cold case status in 2022. Investigators acknowledged that time had become the enemy. Key witnesses had died. The original evidence, from the boat, from the dinghy, from the clothing Natalie was wearing when she was found, had never been preserved to the forensic standards that would later become routine. Memories had been told and retold, shaped and reshaped by lawyers and journalists and book deals, until they resembled performances more than recollections. The police report from the original investigation, later obtained by reporters, described the main salon of the Splendor as being in disarray the morning after Natalie disappeared, with evidence of broken glass on the floor. When asked about the glass, Wagner said it was probably from rough seas. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also the kind of explanation that answers a question without illuminating anything. The Splendor itself changed hands several times after Natalie's death. It drifted out of Hollywood and ended up, improbably, in Honolulu's Alawai Harbor, where it sat unused for more than 20 years, accumulating unpaid mooring fees and a patina of rust and neglect. By the time the Los Angeles County Sheriff's homicide detectives traveled to Hawaii in December of 2011 to examine the vessel as part of their reopened investigation, it was barely recognizable as the yacht that had carried movie stars to Catalina. In January of 2020, the state of Hawaii finally hauled it from the water. It was a scrap heap. Nothing remained of the salon where they had been drinking, or the deck where they had been arguing, or the swim step from which Natalie may or may not have fallen. Natalie's daughter, Natasha Gregson Wagner, produced the 2020 HBO documentary, Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind. How she died, Natasha said, has overshadowed her work and the person that she was. She called Wagner, who helped raise her, one of the great loves of my life. She described him as courageous for revisiting the pain on camera. Her Aunt Lana took a different position. Of course he killed her, Lana said in 2021. The daughter and the sister have not reconciled their accounts. They may never. What remains is 56 films across 4 decades. 3 Oscar nominations before the age of 25, a Golden Globe win, a transition from child star to adult actress that almost no one else has survived. Not Mickey Rooney, not Shirley Temple, not any of the bright-faced children who burned through Hollywood's attention and emerged on the other side diminished. Natalie not only survived the crossing, she did some of her best work on the far side of it. She worked with Wells and Ford and Kazan and Wise and Pollock. She held her own opposite Dean, Beatty, McQueen, Redford. She was funny in comedies and devastating in dramas. She stood just under 5'2" and filled every frame she was in. Critics have suggested that her career represents a portrait of American womanhood in transition, from the obedient daughter of the 50s to the questioning woman of the 60s to the mother of the 70s trying to define herself outside the gaze of the camera. There is truth in that reading. What Natalie herself knew was simpler and harder: how to walk onto a set and make people believe she was someone else, because she had been doing it since she was 4 years old, because her mother had made sure she could cry before she could read. She was also, through all those years, a woman who hid a broken bone beneath a bracelet, who carried a prophecy about dark water like a second heartbeat, who kept her husband's secrets and her own trauma and her mother's cruelty locked behind a smile so convincing that millions of people believed it was all there was. Natalie Wood once said, "At night, when the sky is full of stars and the sea is still, you get the wonderful sensation that you are floating in space." She said this, a woman who lived in terror of dark water, about being on the water at night. On the evening of November 28, 1981, she had a film nearly finished, a stage debut scheduled for February, plans for a novel adaptation with Timothy Hutton. She had 2 daughters, Natasha, 11, and Courtney, 7. She had a husband she had married twice. She put on her nightgown and her socks and her red jacket. She did not put on the bracelet. She went into the dark water by whatever means, and she did not come back. The Brainstorm production collapsed. MGM wanted to collect insurance from Lloyd's of London and shelved the picture. Trumbull fought to finish it, rewriting scenes, using Natalie's sister Lana for the few remaining shots, cutting sequences that involved water. The film was released in September of 1983, almost 2 years after her death, on a small number of screens with minimal promotion. It carried a simple dedication. To Natalie. The experience left Trumbull so embittered that he abandoned the feature film industry. "This feature film industry is just not working for me," he said. He did not direct another Hollywood film for decades. Robert Wagner married actress Jill St. John in 1990. Investigators later established he had begun seeing St. John publicly less than 2 months after Natalie's death. They remain married. Wagner is now in his mid-90s. Maria Gurdon, the mother who packed the family and moved to Los Angeles, who tore the butterfly, who refused to set the broken wrist, who kept silent about the assault, who transmitted the fortune teller's prophecy about dark water to her daughter and then watched it come true, died in 1998 at the age of 90. The slashed portrait with the glued-on bracelet survived her. Natalie Wood's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame is at 640 North Vine Street. Flowers appear there sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. The water off Catalina Island is dark tonight, the way it was that night, the way it has always been. It does not remember what it took.